I want to welcome everybody back to our next session. And so today we are looking at the Gospel of Luke. Make sure you have your notes, make sure you have your gospel chart as we will go through the Gospel of Luke today. Make sure you're keeping up with your reading. Make sure that you're keeping up with all of your quizzes, either your reading quizzes or your verse quizzes. We are getting to the end of this first section, which will be on Luke, and then we will look at John, and then we will have an exam on the information we've done so far, and you should be getting a review sheet in Blackboard as we get close to that time. I want us to look at the Gospel of Luke right now, and Luke is actually part one of a two-part book, the other book being the book of Acts. And so Luke is actually kind of tells the first part, Acts tells the second part. And so Luke taking us from the beginning of Jesus' life to the end, and then Acts picking up from where Jesus, at the end of his life, through the beginning of the early church. And so best way to think of Luke is the first part of a two-part series. And one of Luke's themes is around the history of Jesus, but the certainty of the history of Jesus. He says in the beginning that he is writing to give an accurate account of the events of Jesus' life. And he is really stressing here that Christ is the Savior for the Gentiles. The Gentiles is a word that was used in Jewish culture that represents anybody who is a non-Jew. I'm not sure who's taking the class, but if there's anybody in here taking the class who is not Jewish, you would be considered a Gentile. And so that word Gentile really means anybody who's not Jew. Maybe say today, you say, okay, somebody's not a Christian. That means that they're not a Christian. And so the word Gentile means that you're not a Jew. So he's writing to all the people who are not Jewish. So let's learn a little bit about Luke. As I said, whoever wrote Luke also wrote the book of Acts. Both are dedicated to a man named Theophilus. Theophilus, we don't know a whole lot about, other than he was probably wealthy because he was able to pay somebody to write an account of Jesus' life in the early church. So he must have had some money. Both Luke and Acts have a very similar style, which is very important in ancient books. When you're looking at how the person writes, how they form their sentences, how they use words, what kind of words do they use, that style is very important in understanding authorship. And so Luke is a companion of Paul. Remember, authorship was designed on either associate or close associate. So Luke is an associate of Paul's. A lot of there in both Luke and Acts, we have what are called the we sections. So Luke says, we went and did this, or we went here. And so he's talking about him and Paul, especially more in the book of Acts than in Luke, but he was a companion of Paul's. Like Mark, traveled with them and would have heard the stories. And so if we look at the Gospels real quickly before we go on, we have Matthew, we have Mark, we have Luke, and we have John. And if we look at these real quickly, let me choose a color that will show up here. White. Mark and Luke are two gospels not written by one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. On the other hand, Matthew and John are. So we have two gospels written by Jesus' 12 disciples, one of his original 12 disciples, Matthew and John. But Mark and Luke are not. And so that's also one of the reasons that we have four accounts, is that we have Mark and Luke hearing the stories from Paul and from Peter and writing them. And then we have Matthew and John, who were both original disciples, and telling us the story. And we get back to talking about Luke. Tradition fits that Luke is the author. That's early church tradition. So who was Luke? Well, we know Luke was a physician. Paul calls Luke in the book of Colossians the beloved physician. Now, if I were able to ask you questions right now, I would say, okay, what was Matthew's job? Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew uses a lot of tax information in Matthew. Mark was a missionary. He was a man of action. Luke is a physician. Luke's interest in sickness and the use of medical terms stands out in both Luke and Acts because he just describes things. So, for example, in Luke chapter 8, verse 43, he describes the woman in detail about the issue of blood. He goes into more detail, and so he describes those things, which would have been an interest to somebody who was a doctor. Luke is writing, as we said, to Gentiles. As I said, Gentiles are those who are not Jewish. Could have been Greek, could have been Roman, could have been from anywhere. But if you're not Jewish, you are a Gentile. Most likely, Luke is writing to the Greeks. Mark wrote to the Romans. Matthew wrote to the Jews. Luke is writing to the Greeks. And so each one of those, again, reason for four Gospels, each one's writing to a different audience to get that story. I tell people, there's people that I talk to that I will never be able to make an influence in, where somebody else might be able to make an influence because of their culture, their background, things like that. And so Luke probably could have been written from anywhere, but if he's with Paul, I think most likely he's probably writing from the city of Caesarea, and so probably on one of his journeys. That's probably kind of where he's writing. Would have been on the coast near Israel. Now, we talk about the date. Luke was probably the last of the synoptic Gospels. Remember, those are Matthew and Mark. Oops, forgot my M. Mark and Luke. Luke 1 tells us, the writer says that other eyewitnesses have been written. And so that's, again, for the assumption of this class is that Mark came first, then Matthew and Luke. So Luke is telling us, hey, there's been other eyewitnesses, other accounts. He also could have been talking about some of the other books of Paul's that maybe had been written by that point, a few of them. But he tells us that there's other things written. Luke is also a very consecutive order. He writes things. He's also very uh, his gospel is a very accurate his kind of order, much like Mark. And so, if Mark is written in the early 50 A.D., Matthew coming late 50s, early 60s, I'm going to suggest a date for Luke to be around the mid 60s, but before AD 70. Again, Jewish temple would have been destroyed, not much being written after that except for a few books. So I'm going to suggest for Luke probably around the mid 60s. So what we're going to do is kind of talk a little bit about the book, some of the details that come in there. The first thing is a genealogy. Matthew and Luke are the only two Gospels that have a genealogy of Christ. Luke goes his genealogy all the way back to Adam. Matthew goes back to Abraham. But Luke goes all the way back to Adam because when he's writing to Gentiles, they may understand who Abraham is, but more importantly, they're going to understand who the first man was. And so Luke goes all the way back to Adam, and he really is showing the Gentiles that Christ came for them also, not just for the Jews. He's saying, listen, you non-Jews, Christ came for you just as much as he did for anybody else. And he starts with Joseph and not Mary. Matthew goes to Mary. Luke goes to Joseph. So there's a little bit of difference there in the genealogies between Luke and Matthew. Luke also gives us a little bit of a narrative about his childhood. And Luke's birth account is different than Matthew's birth account. Luke focuses in on the shepherds. He focuses on the common people. He focuses on them coming. He talks about what happens before he's born. He talks about his birth. He focuses in on Mary and the story of Elizabeth with John the Baptist. Matthew does not. He talks about his birth in that account and having to why they were in Bethlehem. He talks about him being circumcised the 8th day, even though that was a big Jewish tradition. He talks about that. He talks about being dedicated after 40 days. And he has a little bit of mention of his early youth when he and his family go up to Jerusalem when he's around 12. That's when he goes missing for a few days. Luke tells us those things. Matthew does not. A lot of times in the birth story, especially at Christmas time, we have people reading, say, the Christmas story, and they're reading the story from Luke. Luke also gives us a lot of parables. Now, in the Gospels, there are 37 parables in all the Gospels. Luke records 23 of those parables, with 16 of those 23 only in Luke. So if I'm studying the Gospels and I really want to focus in on the parables, most likely I'm going to be in the book of Luke. And I'm going to be learning about those parables because that's where I'm going to see those parables, especially the 16 that only appear in Luke. Now, Luke has a common difference, or has a difference between, not a common difference, but has a difference between Matthew and Mark especially, in that he focuses a lot on women. Now, that is important because women in early church, early first century, had no social status. And so to tell the stories about the women and to focus in on the women, Luke is focusing on those Gentiles, non-Jewish people, and trying to express the importance of the women that played a role in the stories. There are a total of 13 mentioned. Some are repeated, and I don't have all 13 mentioned. Obviously, Mary, Jesus' mother, sisters Mary and Martha, Mary Magdalene, who some people also believe was the woman who was caught in adultery, the poor widow, the widow of Nain, whose son got resurrected. And so it's very interesting that Luke would focus in a lot on the story about women, especially in light of the cultural differences. Luke also does have an emphasis on money, but his emphasis on money is about the mercy for the poor, not paying the tax like it was in Matthew. And even 7 or 8 of the parables that Luke has in his book, out of all the parables, focus on the poor and money to the poor. Now, one of the unique, other unique features of Mark is he talks a lot about angels more than any of the other Gospels. He also talks about prayer, having multiple passages on prayer, and music. There are at least 4 songs in Luke. The first one being in Luke chapter 1, about the song that to Mary by the angel, when the angel comes to see Mary. Mary's song in Luke chapter 1, the song of the angels rejoicing in Luke chapter 2, and Simeon's song in Luke chapter 2, all regarding around either the birth or after the birth of Jesus. And so this is just some unique features that come up in Luke. Now, what I'd like you to do is we are going to look at a list of the disciples, and so I'm going to give you some verses here. I'm going to give you some verses, and so you can write these down. The first one is Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. So Matthew 10, 2 through 4. Mark 3, 13 through 19. And then Luke 6, 13 through 16. This is the list of the disciples, and I have Matthew and Mark already up here, which I also believe are in your notes. And then so if we read from from Luke chapter 6, we're going to talk a little bit about the disciples. We're going to talk a little bit what we see in this listing here of the disciples. So Luke chapter 6, verse 13 through 16. And when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, who also he named apostles. And then verse 14. Simon, whose also his name is Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called Zealot, and Judas, the brother of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also was the traitor. Now, interesting, John does not have a listing of the 12 disciples. Only Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. And so I'm going to put Luke's list up here. We have Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So I want you to take a look at this list and to yourself, if you were in class, we would be talking about this out loud, but to yourself, I want you to look at this list here, and I want us to see some similarities, differences, things like that. So to yourself, what are some things that you might see as some of the similarities between the list? Well, if you look at it, hopefully what sticks out, first of all, is, I'm not really good with my pen today, Peter always appears first in every list. Judas appearing last in every list. So that's the major thing. You might also see that the group first four are always the same. Not the same order, but always the same. Peter, Andrew, James, John. Peter, James, John, Andrew. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. You might also notice then that the second group, again, is always the same, not necessarily the same order, always starting with Philip. Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew. Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas. Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas. The last group, also the same thing, always starting with James, the son of Alphaeus, to separate him from James up here. James, that is Simon the Zealot, Judas. James, that is Simon the Zealot, Judas. James, Simon the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So you might notice some of the difference. You also might think, well, I look at this list here, and especially in this last group, I have Thaddeus here. I have a Thaddeus here, but I have no Thaddeus over here. But I do have one here, Judas, the son of James, who is not listed in these. Well, that's because Matthew and Mark change his name from Judas to Thaddeus, because let's be honest, if we know that a guy named Judas betrayed Jesus, would you want your name to be called Judas? Probably not. So Thaddeus and Judas, the son of James, even though Luke distinguishes between the two, are the same person. Now, interesting to note also that Judas Iscariot is always listed last. I have some asterisks beside it because Matthew and Mark say Judas Iscariot who betrayed. Obviously, they're writing after Jesus has already been crucified. Judas has already betrayed him. So they're saying this is Judas who is going to betray. So it's kind of like if you were reading it for the first time, you would know that that's going to happen. While Luke, on the other hand, says who would betray. He's saying that he would. So he's kind of making a different stance. Or some versions have, or become the traitor. So again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only Gospels that include the story of the 12 disciples and a listing of them. John does not. Let's go through a real simple, quick outline. And we have again, the birth narrative here. So much in Luke, really even more than Matthew, about Jesus' birth, his genealogy. Genealogy comes later, does not come at the beginning like it does in Matthew. We also have the temptation narrative. We have his ministry in Galilee. We have questions about his what we call Christological questions, questions that are posed to him, his teachings. We have his confessions. And again, remember, I go pretty quickly through the outline. We have his first journey. We have some of his parable teaching, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, the unjust. So there's a lot of parables that are going on. We have the prayer parable. We have his teaching about service, his authority, attempts to trap him. And then we begin to get into the crucifixion and resurrection. You should be reading in this lesson area a paper on the trial of Jesus, focusing in on the Jewish trial. So if you've not read that, you need to get that off a blackboard and to read about the trials that Jesus has. We have the resurrection narrative, and Luke kind of ends abruptly with Jesus' ascension, and then we'll pick back up with that when he gets to the book of Acts. And so let me put up here real quickly the key facts. Luke was a physician. He is writing to the Greeks. His key verse is Luke 19:10. The theme is that he is a savior for the Gentiles, those who are not Jewish. He views Christ as the Son of Man. His outstanding feature is the parables, because again, 16 parables that are only in Luke. And his arrangement is chronological. He is a very historical person, taking his genealogy all the way back to Adam. And he has quotes from Jesus, somewhere between 90 and 100 references to Old Testament verses in the Gospel of Luke. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to email me or stop by my office if you happen to be on campus.